The world had already ended. Alex Mercer just hadn't gotten the memo. He came back to consciousness the way he always did, not with the slow, groggy crawl of human waking, but all at once, like a switch thrown in a dark room. One moment nothing, the next, everything. The smell hit him first, rot and pine and something. Underneath both of those things. Something organic and wrong, that is. Viral sensors catalogued before. His eyes even opened. Decomposition on a massive scale. Not a body. Not a dozen bodies. A world of them. He was lying in a ditch off what had once been Interstate 95. Somewhere in Virginia, if the road signs still meant anything. The asphalt was cracked and sun-bleached. Weeds splitting the median like the earth was slowly reclaiming what mankind had paved over. Abandoned cars sat rusting in both lanes, doors hanging open, luggage scattered. A child's shoe sitting alone in the fast lane with no context and no owner. The sky above was a washed-out grey. Clouds moving fast over a landscape that had gone profoundly, permanently quiet. No city hum. No aircraft. No distant traffic. Just wind, and beneath the wind, a sound he didn't have a name for yet. A low, wet shuffling. Dozens of sources. Getting closer. Mercer stood. The biomass moved through him instinctively. His body running diagnostics the way other men check their pockets. Everything intact. The blacklight virus coiled through every cell, responsive and hungry, waiting. He flexed his right hand and felt the familiar tension of potential. Claws. A thought away. Armor a heartbeat behind that. Whatever had brought him here, wherever here was. It hadn't taken anything from him. That was either very good news or the setup for something considerably worse. The walkers came around the tree line in a loose, shambling mass. 30 of them, maybe 40. Drawn by vibration. Or sound or some vestigial hunting instinct. That death hadn't fully extinguished. They had been people once. He could see it in the remnants of their clothing. A mechanic's jumpsuit, a woman in a floral dress with half her face missing. A teenager in a varsity jacket whose insides were on the outside. Their eyes were white-grey and unanimated, mouths working in anticipation of meat. Mercer watched them come with his head tilted slightly. The posture of a man doing math. His viral sensors reached out, tasting the air around them. No heat signatures worth measuring. No meaningful biological complexity. Whatever animated these things. It wasn't life. Not in any category his systems recognized. They were biological machines running on fumes. Infectious in some way he couldn't fully parse yet. Driven by appetite and nothing else. He let 3 of them reach him. The first one lunged. With its mouth open, and Mercer sidestepped with a casual economy of motion that put him behind it before it finished the lunge. His hand closed around its skull and he consumed it, not fully. Not a real absorption. Just enough contact to pull the surface biology, the infection, the cellular memory of whatever this thing had been. The information flooded through him in a second. The virus, the hunger, the transformation sequence. He catalogued it all with the detached efficiency of a system, designed to assimilate everything it touches. Interesting, was the closest his mind came to surprise. The whole world. The other 2 reached him simultaneously, and he put both down with a single horizontal sweep of a blade arm that extended and retracted so fast it looked like the air had cut them. The rest of the herd arrived and he moved through them like weather, not running, not panicked, just methodical. A tendril here, a redirected momentum there. He didn't even bother with full biomass consumption. These things had nothing worth taking. Hollow vessels running a primitive infection. He understood this virus the way a PhD understands a child's sketch of a molecule. When it was done, 40 walkers were on the ground and Mercer wasn't breathing hard because Mercer didn't need to breathe. He stood in the middle of the highway and looked at the horizon. A water tower in the distance. The skeletal frame of what might have been a town. And beyond that, rising in a thin dark line, smoke. Controlled smoke, not a wildfire, not an accident. Someone burning something deliberately. Someone alive. He started walking. It took him less than an hour to find the first signs of organized habitation. A tripwire strung between 2 trees, crude but functional. Shell casings on the ground, multiple calibers. Evidence of a firefight that had happened weeks ago based on the oxidation. A wooden spike barrier half constructed and then abandoned. The tools still lying. In the grass like whoever built it had. Left in a hurry or hadn't left at all. He absorbed a walker wearing a tattered military jacket near the tree line. The dead man had been a corporal, stationed at a FEMA camp 12 miles east. The memories were fragmented. The camp had fallen in the first weeks. What came through clearly was the scale of it. This wasn't a local outbreak. This was systemic, total, civilization ending. The whole country. Maybe the whole world. Mercer processed that information without sentiment. He had watched New York eat itself alive. He had been the thing that nearly ended Manhattan. A dead world wasn't grief-inducing. It was context. What caught his attention as he moved deeper into the woods was something more immediate. Tracks. Booted feet. Multiple individuals, moving with purpose. Tire tracks. Heavy vehicle. Recent. And spent casings. Not from a firefight, from an execution. 3 sets of knee impressions in the mud. 3 people kneeling. Brass from a single shooter standing. He crouched and examined the casings. A particular make, a particular caliber. Someone with enough ammunition to waste it making a point. In the distance, the sound of engines. If you want to see more crossover stories like this, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see face the apocalypse in the comments below. May the force be with you. He melted into the shadows of the tree line as the trucks rolled past, 3 of them. Flatbeds and a panel van. Men riding in the truck beds with automatic weapons held loose and comfortable. The posture of people who had stopped worrying about, looking threatening, because they'd long since made their point. On the side of the panel van, painted in rough black letters, the Saviors. Mercer filed the name away. He followed the trucks. He followed them for 11 miles. Not on the road, through the trees parallel to it, moving at a pace that kept the convoy in sight without ever closing the distance enough to be detected. His biomass shifted subtly as he moved, darkening his skin tone to something closer to shadow, reducing his silhouette against the tree line. Old habits. In New York he had learned that information. Was the first weapon and proximity. Was the second. In this world, apparently, those rules still applied. The trucks moved with the confidence of people who owned the road. No scouts ahead, no rear security worth mentioning. Just men riding in truck beds with weapons across their knees, talking and laughing. Occasionally firing a single round at a walker they passed without even fully turning to. Aim. Casual. Practiced. The violence of people for whom killing had become background noise. He absorbed everything he could from a distance, their patrol patterns, their communication style, the way the driver of the lead truck used a CB radio at regular intervals to check in with someone. He called the sanctuary. Supply. Run returning. 12 men. Goods acquired. No casualties, which seemed to disappoint the voice on the other end slightly. Like casualties would have made the story better. When they reached a fortified checkpoint, concrete barriers, razor wire, 2 guards in a watchtower. Mercer stopped at the tree line and watched the gate procedure. The guards knew the drivers by name. There was a system, a code phrase, a count of returning personnel against a manifest, organized, methodical. This wasn't a gang. This was an institution. He pulled back into the woods and shifted his focus northeast, where the smoke had been thicker earlier in the day. He found the second settlement an hour before dark. It was a neighborhood, actual houses behind actual walls, the walls being a patchwork of sheet metal, lumber, and what appeared to be the crushed bodies of repurposed RVs welded together in desperation and ingenuity. Watchtowers at the corners, cleared kill zones outside the perimeter, gardens visible from above the walls, neat rows of vegetables, children's voices somewhere inside, the sound of a generator running, people, actual functioning people building something that looked, from the outside, like it was meant to last. He watched it for a long time. A patrol came out through a reinforced gate, 4 people, 2 men and 2 women, moving in a practiced formation that suggested military training in at least one of them. They swept the immediate tree line, with the focused attention of people who had learned the hard Weigh what happened when you got sloppy. One of them, a woman with close-cropped hair and a shotgun, came within 20 feet of where Mercer stood motionless against a pine tree, his surface biomass having shifted to approximate the bark's texture and color. She stopped, looked directly at the tree. Mercer didn't breathe, didn't move, waited. She moved on. He spent the night in the woods, not because he needed sleep, but because he needed to think. The blacklight virus didn't require rest, but the mind running. What remained of Alex Mercer's consciousness? That fractured, complicated thing that had survived death and transformation, and the systematic consumption of thousands of lives, still processed better in stillness. He sat with his back against an oak tree and turned the day's information over. A world dead. A virus that converted the deceased into something mobile and hungry, transmissible through bite, unkillable through conventional damage to the body except for the brain. An organized armed faction. The saviors, operating with the resources and confidence of a dominant power. A smaller settlement doing its best to look defensible while clearly not being dominant. The execution site he'd found earlier. 3 people kneeling in the mud. The shape of the situation assembled itself without him having to work for it. He had seen this before. Not the walkers, the dynamic. A powerful faction extracting resources from smaller ones through threat and violence. Protection racket written in blood and gasoline. The saviors weren't surviving the apocalypse. They were running it. He absorbed a lone walker near dawn. A man who had been a resident of a community called the Hilltop. Killed on the road 3 weeks ago. The memories were fragmentary but useful. A place called Alexandria. A man named Rick. A debt paid in supplies. A man named Negan who collected that debt personally, and whose name made even the dead man's surface. Memories feel afraid. Negan. The name had weight. Mercer turned it over. People who inspired that kind of fear in their enemies. Subconscious were either genuinely dangerous or masterful at theater. In his experience, the most effective ones were both. He was still considering the question when the saviors found him. Not through any failure of concealment. On his part, they found the walker he'd put down near the road, examined the wounds with professional curiosity, and started tracking backward with the focus of people who did this for a living. 6 of them, spreading out through the trees in a wide net, communicating with hand signals, moving quietly. Mercer watched them close the net from the center of it and decided that running wasn't interesting. He stepped out from behind a tree directly in front of the man leading the sweep. The man, 30s, heavy build, a barbed wire tattoo climbing his neck, brought his rifle up in a single practice motion. Don't move. Mercer looked at the rifle, looked at the man, put his hands up with the calm of someone performing a social courtesy rather than complying with a genuine threat. You track well, Mercer said. His voice came out rougher than he expected, disused. Most people make noise. Shut your mouth. The other 5 materialized out of the trees, weapons up, forming a loose semicircle. The tattooed man, clearly the leader, kept his eyes on Mercer with an intensity that suggested he was trying to work something out. You alone? Yes. What happened to the walker back on the road? I killed it. With what? There's no weapon on you and the wound pattern is. He stopped. Looked at Mercer's hands. Looked at his face. Something shifted behind his eyes. A recalibration. What are you? Complicated, Mercer said. The leader made a decision the way competent men made decisions, quickly, and without visible deliberation. You're coming with us. Negan's going to want to see this. Mercer considered the 11 men he'd watched on the convoy yesterday. The fortified checkpoint, the organized institution behind the razor wire. He considered the name that even dead men's memories were afraid of. He considered that walking into the sanctuary voluntarily gave him information he couldn't get from the tree line. All right, he said. The tattooed man blinked. He had clearly prepared for resistance. All right. That's what I said. They zip-tied his hands in front of him. He let them. The plastic, the tensile equivalent of wet paper against what his wrists could become, and marched him to a truck that had been waiting on a Service Road a quarter-mile east. He sat in the truck bed surrounded by 5 armed men and watched the Virginia countryside roll past and thought about what a man named Negan would make of someone like him. More importantly, he thought about what he would make of Negan. The sanctuary resolved out of the landscape like a fever dream of the old world. A factory complex ringed with chain link topped in razor wire. The fence lined on the outside with walkers on chains. A grotesque early warning system that was also a statement of philosophy. We use the dead as tools. What does that make us? Workers moved in the yard with the careful posture of people performing for an audience they couldn't see. Guards on elevated platforms. A hierarchy visible in the body language of every person. Mercer's eyes swept across, who walked freely, who walked carefully, who watched the ground. The truck rolled through. The gate and the men around him climbed out with the relief of people returning home. Mercer climbed out and looked up at the factory and felt something he hadn't felt since Manhattan. Curiosity. They walked him through the sanctuary like a trophy. Not roughly. Nobody grabbed him. Nobody shoved him forward. The men flanking him maintained a professional distance that suggested the tattooed leader, whose name Mercer had gathered was Wade, had communicated something specific about the kind of careful that was required here. The zip ties were still on his wrists and he was still letting them be. The workers in the yard stopped what they were doing and watched him pass with the hollow eyes of people who had learned that curiosity was a luxury with a price attached. He catalogued everything. The internal layout, guard rotations, structural weak points in the factory walls, the location of the generator by sound, fuel storage by smell, armory by the particular way 2 guards stood, outside a reinforced door on the second level with the self-conscious posture of men guarding something valuable. The population was larger than he'd estimated from outside, several hundred people. A genuine working community, built on a specific and brutal social contract that was visible in every interaction he witnessed. Point system. Hierarchy enforced by proximity to one man. That man made his entrance the way men who understood theater made entrances. The crowd in the main hall parted, not because anyone announced him, but because a ripple of awareness moved through the room the way a current moves through water, and people simply found reasons to be elsewhere or to be very still. Negan came down a metal staircase with Lucille resting on his shoulder. Leather jacket, easy smile, the particular loose-limbed confidence of a man who had not experienced physical fear in long enough that he'd forgotten what the posture looked like. Behind him, for men in identical leather jackets, the saviors in a circle. Mercer noted, the ones who got the jackets. Negan stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Mercer the way a man looks at a painting he can't quite place. Well, he said. Shit. He walked a slow circle, not around Mercer specifically, just repositioning himself the way dominant animals. Repositioned, not threatening. Just reminding the room of the geometry. Wade tells me you walked out of the woods like you were taking a stroll. Hands up, no weapon, no fear. He tilted his head. No fear is the part that got my attention. Should I be afraid? Mercer asked. The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of people trying not to be noticed, the quiet of people bracing. Negan smiled wider. I like that. I genuinely, sincerely like that. He stopped circling and faced Mercer directly. Close enough now that most men would have felt the pressure of the proximity. Mercer felt nothing, except the continued work of his senses. Cataloguing the man in front of him. 6'2". Muscular, functional rather than aesthetic. Fast hands. The way he held Lucille suggested practiced use, not decoration. Intelligent eyes doing the same assessment Mercer was doing, and aware that they were doing it, which was the most dangerous kind of intelligence. Cut him loose, Negan said. Wade hesitated. Boss, we don't know what. I said cut him loose, Wade. If our friend here wanted to make a mess, zip ties were not going to be the thing that stopped him. He held Mercer's gaze while he said it, and in that moment Mercer understood something about Negan that the dead man's memories hadn't conveyed. He wasn't performing confidence. He genuinely had an instinct. 4-threat assessment that had kept him alive and dominant in a world that killed the slow and the wrong. The zip ties came off. Negan gestured to the space around them, the hall, the people, the whole organism of the sanctuary. So, what do you think? Functional, Mercer said. Sustainable if the resource extraction holds. Vulnerable to a coordinated external assault on the eastern wall and the generator. Silence. Then Negan laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. He's either the most useful man I've ever met or the most dangerous. Possibly both. He pointed Lucille at Mercer in a gesture that was somehow not threatening. More like punctuation. What's your name? Mercer. Just Mercer. That's enough. Negan nodded slowly, something settling in his expression, the recalibration of a man revising his model of a situation. All right, just Mercer. Here's how this works. Everybody in my world works for me. That's not a negotiation, that's physics. The sun comes up. People work for Negan. What varies is the quality of that arrangement. He spread his arms to indicate the sanctuary around them. Top earners live well. People with valuable skills live very well. And you, he pointed again, clearly have something valuable. I watched the footage. Mercer went still. Footage. Trail cam. Eastern fence perimeter. Motion activated. Negan's smile now had a different quality. The smile of a man who had just played a card. Caught about 40 seconds. Of you walking through a herd like it. Was a revolving door. No weapons. No bite. Nothing. He paused. So what I need to understand, Mercer, is what exactly I'm looking at. The room waited. Mercer considered his options with the speed his mind operated at, considerably faster than the humans watching him. He could lie, but Negan had the footage. And the intelligence to know a lie was coming if he offered one. He could refuse to answer, which would shift the dynamic in a direction that ended in either violence or a standoff, neither of which served his current information gathering purpose. He could tell the truth, which in this case was so far outside the framework of this world's reality that it functioned almost as effectively as a lie. I'm infected, Mercer said. Not like them. Something different. The virus that runs through me isn't what killed the world. It's older. More complete. It rewrote my biology so thoroughly that I'm no longer susceptible to anything this world's infection can do to me. And it gives me capabilities that are difficult to explain without a demonstration. Negan stared at him for a long moment. Difficult to explain without a demonstration. He repeated, tasting the phrase. I do love a demonstration. Not here. Mercer looked around the hall. Too many people. Another beat of quiet. Then Negan pointed at him with one finger and turned to the room. Everybody out. It wasn't a request. The hall cleared in under a minute. The saviors filing out with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned not to ask questions at moments like this, leaving only Negan, his 4 leather-jacketed lieutenants, and Wade, who had clearly decided that whatever happened next he was going to witness it. Mercer raised his right hand and let the claws come, not fully, just the first knuckles worth of transformation, the fingers elongating and darkening and hardening into something that was clearly not human anatomy and clearly not a prosthetic. He held it for 3 seconds. Let it recede. Negan had not stepped back. His lieutenants had. That gap told Mercer everything he needed to know about the distance between Negan and the men around him. Okay, Negan said quietly. The theatrical register was gone. Just for a moment, just the real man underneath the performance, recalibrating its speed. Okay, so here's what I'm thinking. He sat down on the edge of a table, Lucille across his knees, suddenly casual, in the way that very confident people became casual when they were working hardest. I'm thinking that a man with your particular set of gifts, operating freely in my territory, is either an asset or a problem, and I don't like problems. You're going to offer me a position, Mercer said. I'm going to offer you the best position anyone in this dead world has been offered. Negan's eyes were level and direct. Work for me. Your own people, your own operations, resources on request. The communities we collect from will fall in line faster if they know what's waiting behind the threat. You'd be, he considered the word, a deterrent, the kind that only has to be used once. Mercer looked at him, at the man who had built a functioning empire on the currency of fear, who had kept hundreds of people alive through methods that would have been monstrous in the old world and were merely the prevailing logic in this one, who was, by this world's brutal metrics, genuinely effective. I'll think about it, Mercer said. Negan blinked. You'll think about it. You heard me. The smile came back, slower this time, and more genuine for it. Yeah, Negan said. Yeah, I think I did. He stood, lifted Lucille back to his shoulder. Wade, get our guest a room. The good kind. As Mercer followed Wade up the metal staircase, he heard Negan behind him, voice low and thoughtful, speaking to no one in particular. Interesting, Negan said. Mercer didn't look back. He was already thinking about Alexandria. He stayed at the sanctuary for 3 days. Not because Negan's offer was tempting. The offer was structurally irrelevant to anything Mercer actually wanted, which was information. But because 3 days inside the sanctuary's walls was worth more than 3 months. Watching it from the tree line, he moved through the facility with the measured freedom of a guest who had not yet given an answer, which meant nobody had orders regarding him and nobody wanted to be the one who provoked the man from the trail cam footage without authorization. He used the ambiguity the way he used shadows. What he found troubled him in the specific way that things troubled Alex Mercer, not with moral outrage, which required an investment in other people's suffering he had largely burned through years ago, but with the cold recognition of a pattern he understood from the inside. The sanctuary's population was stratified into workers and earners. The workers living on rationed food and borrowed safety. The earners living on points accumulated through service and compliance. The workers' eyes had a particular quality, not broken exactly, but compressed. People who had traded the possibility of resistance for the certainty of another day. He had seen that quality in New York, in the faces of people who understood that the thing moving through their city couldn't be stopped and had decided that surviving it was enough. The difference was that the thing moving through their city had been him. Here, the thing was a man with a baseball bat and a very clear philosophy about leverage. On the second day, he absorbed a worker, a woman named Clara, who had died of infection 3 weeks prior and whose body had been disposed of outside the wire. The surface memory pull from the walker that had been her gave him the interior map of the sanctuary's social architecture with a clarity no amount of observation could have provided. The point system, the wives, the way descent was managed, not through overt brutality most of the time, but through the careful manipulation of dependency. Negan had built a machine that ran on the specific fear of losing what little you had, which was a more durable fuel than the fear of pain. He spent the 3rd night on the roof of the factory, looking northeast toward where he calculated Alexandria to be, turning the geometry of the situation over. The Saviors controlled 5 communities through Tribute, Alexandria, the Hilltop, the Kingdom, and 2 smaller settlements whose names hadn't surfaced in any of the memories he'd absorbed. Combined population across all of them was somewhere in the range of 600 to 800 people. The sanctuary had perhaps 300, of whom maybe 80 were combat-capable saviors. The math of revolution was not complicated. The communities outnumbered the saviors significantly. What they lacked was coordination, weaponry, and the will to absorb casualties in the short term for gains in the long term. What they also lacked, he thought, was something that couldn't be killed. He was gone before dawn on the 4th day, over the fence at a point between 2 guard rotations, leaving no trace except the absence of himself. He heard the radio traffic start 20 minutes later, Wade's voice, controlled but tight. reporting to Negan. He was far enough away by then that the words were just vibration in the air. He reached Alexandria by mid-morning. The walls were concrete, poured sections, serious construction. The kind of permanence that indicated someone with both vision and resources had built this before. The world fully collapsed. He circled it twice, reading the guard positions, the entry procedure, the body language of the people on the wall. Different from the sanctuary. The guards here watched the outside with genuine fear rather than professional routine. These were people defending something they loved, rather than enforcing something they owned. The distinction was visible from 100 yards. He walked up to the gate and knocked. The reaction from the wall was immediate. 2 rifles and a shotgun appearing over the parapet. Voices calling for identification. A radio crackling as someone was summoned. He stood with his hands visible and waited with the patience of something that didn't experience waiting the way humans did. The man who came to the gate was not what Mercer expected. Rick Grimes looked like someone had taken a person apart and reassembled them with most of the pieces in the right places, but all of them slightly worn through. Beard, haunted eyes, a Python revolver on his hip that he kept his hand near without touching. He studied Mercer through the gate with an assessment that was slower and more thorough than Negan's had been, less theatrical, more fundamental, the evaluation of a man who had learned to read people because being wrong about them had cost him things he couldn't get back. You alone? Rick said. Yes. Where'd you come from? The woods. Before that, further east. Mercer paused. I've been watching this area for several days. I've seen your patrol patterns, your supply runs, and 3 interactions with savior convoys. He held Rick's gaze. I know what they are to you. Something shifted in Rick's face, not fear exactly, but the recognition of exposure. What do you want? Information. The same thing you want from me. Mercer tilted his head. You're trying to decide if I'm a savior plant. I'm not. You're trying to decide if I'm dangerous. I am. What you actually need to decide is whether those 2 things being simultaneously true is a problem or an opportunity. Rick stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked up at the wall. Open it. A woman's voice from above, sharp, cautionary. Rick. Open the gate, Sasha. They put him in a house with 4 armed people outside it, which he found considerate. Rick came back 2 hours later with a woman named Michonne, whose sword he noted with genuine interest, a functional close-quarters weapon in a world where ammunition was finite, wielded with the ease of long practice, and a man named Abraham whose military background was visible in everything, from his posture to the way he swept the rooms, corners before sitting down. Mercer told them enough. Not everything, not the blacklight virus, not the full extent of what he could do, not the sanctuary's complete internal layout, not yet. He told them he was immune. He told them he was harder to kill than anything they'd encountered. He told them he had spent 3 days inside the sanctuary as Negan's prospective employee. Abraham leaned forward at that. You were inside. Guard rotations. Structural layout. Armory location. Population count broken. Down by combat capability. Mercer looked at Rick. 80 effective fighters. You have more people than that across your communities combined. The silence that followed had a specific texture. The silence of people doing math they had been afraid to do. Why are you telling us this? Michonne said. Her voice was measured, the question genuine rather than suspicious. She was, he assessed, the most dangerous person in the room in the way that mattered most. She was watching him with the focused patience of someone who would absolutely follow through. Because the situation is inefficient, Mercer said. Threat is real but not as insurmountable as it's been presented. The communities have the numbers. What they don't have is certainty. He paused. I can provide certainty. Rick had gone very still. What does that mean, exactly? Mercer considered how much to show them. He raised his right hand and let the Transformation run further than he had for Negan. The full clawed configuration. The plates of hardened biomass spreading up his forearm. The surface of his skin shifting and reshaping. With the fluid indifference of something that had long since stopped pretending to be purely human. Abraham pushed back from the table so fast his chair scraped. Michonne's hand went to her sword. And stopped, a decision. Made and unmade in the same second. Rick didn't move. He watched the transformation. With the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by the world's capacity for the impossible and had learned to ask instead, what does this cost and what does it buy? Mercer let the transformation recede. I can walk through a herd of walkers without a scratch. I can absorb information from the dead. I can move through savior territory at night without being detected. I can hit their supply lines, their outposts, their forward positions, faster and more quietly than any team you could field. He looked at Rick steadily. What I can't do is build what comes after. That requires people. Your people. Rick was quiet for a long time. The house settled around them, wind at the windows. The distant sound of Alexandria's population going about the careful business of surviving another day. If we do this, Rick said finally, slowly, you operate on our terms. You don't make decisions unilaterally. You don't, he chose the word carefully, consume anyone living. And when it's done, you're gone. Mercer looked at him, at the man who had somehow held people together through things that should have scattered them permanently, who carried the weight of every decision he'd made and some he hadn't in the lines around his eyes. When it's done, Mercer said, we'll see. It wasn't the answer Rick wanted. It was the only honest one available. Outside, somewhere in the middle distance, a walker hit the wall and fell back, and the community absorbed the sound of it the way it absorbed everything, with the practiced resilience of people who had decided, against all available evidence, that tomorrow was worth protecting. Mercer heard it and thought about Negan. 3 days into realizing his new asset had walked out the door. He thought Negan's reaction would be instructive. Negan's reaction was to burn the Hilltop's food stores. Not Alexandria, not yet, because Alexandria was the point being made. The audience for the lesson. The Hilltop was the example. 3 wagons of winter supplies. The product of 4 months of cultivation and careful rationing. Reduced to ash in 40 minutes while Gregory watched. From the Hilltop's front steps with the hollow compliance of a man who had decided. Survival and dignity were mutually exclusive and had chosen poorly. The message was the same message Negan always sent. Just with the volume turned up. I know something changed. I know you're thinking about it. Here is the cost of thinking. Mercer watched it happen from the tree line a quarter mile out. He had known it was coming. Not the specifics, but the logic. He had been inside the sanctuary. Had walked out without answering. Had then disappeared. Negan was intelligent enough to connect those events to the whisper network that ran between the communities, and arrive at a conclusion that was essentially correct. The burning was both punishment and probe, a pressure applied to see what moved. 3 savior trucks, 20 men, Negan present. In person with Lucille on his shoulder and the easy, theatrical cruelty of a man performing for multiple audiences simultaneously. What Negan didn't know was that Mercer was counting his men. 20 here. Which meant the sanctuary's eastern outpost was running reduced. He'd hit it 2 nights ago. Quietly, absorbing the 4-man crew and leaving nothing behind that looked like anything other than desertion. The western supply cache had gone the night before that. Not destroyed, relocated, specifically to a position Rick's people could access. 12 days of systematic subtraction, conducted in the dark, leaving Negan's operational picture increasingly unreliable without any single event large enough to crystallize into a declaration of war. Mercer had learned patience in New York. Not the human kind, the viral kind. The understanding that a system could be hollowed out from within long before it knew it was dying. He let Negan finish his theater at the Hilltop and drive away. Then he walked to the Hilltop's gate and told them what came next. The meeting happened at the Kingdom. Because the kingdom was they. Faction Negan was most uncertain about and therefore the least likely to be watching closely. Ezekiel received them in his throne room with the composed gravity of a man who had built an entire persona as a bulwark against despair and was now being asked to bet it on a stranger who wasn't entirely human. The tiger, Shiva, watched Mercer from across the room with the focused attention of an apex predator recognizing something outside its taxonomy. Mercer watched her back. She didn't look away. Rick laid out the operational picture: supply line disruptions, outpost casualties that Negan couldn't yet attribute to a coordinated campaign, the Sanctuary's degraded resource position, the timeline. Michonne handled the strategic logic. Jesus, who had arrived from the hilltop with 3 of his best fighters, covered the coordination between communities. It was a competent presentation from people who had been building toward this longer than Mercer had been in this world, who had the conviction of people fighting for something specific, rather than something abstract. Ezekiel listened with his hands folded and his eyes moving between Rick and Mercer in a rhythm that suggested he was calibrating one against the other. "And what is your role in this?" he said finally, addressing Mercer directly. "When the killing begins." "I go in first," Mercer said. "Into the sanctuary." "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. Shiva made a low sound that wasn't quite a growl. "And what happens inside when you do?" "The saviors discover that their advantage was never what they thought it was." Mercer held the king's gaze. "Fear is a weapon that only works until something walks through it. Once I'm inside and the outer defenses are down, your people move. The workers inside won't fight. They've been waiting for a reason not to. The saviors proper will have to choose between holding a position and surviving. Most will choose surviving." "Most," Jesus said. "Some won't. Those are mine." The room absorbed that. Rick spoke carefully. "We've talked about this. The goal is surrender, not. The goal is ending it," Mercer said. "What that requires depends on what they choose." He looked at Rick with the directness that had been making the man uncomfortable for 2 weeks. The eye contact of something that didn't perform deference. "I won't kill a man who puts his weapon down. I will not make the same promise about a man who doesn't." It wasn't the answer Rick wanted. It was the same honest answer he'd been giving since Alexandria. And Rick had been making peace with it incrementally, the way a pragmatist made peace with the tools available to him. Ezekiel looked at the tiger. Some private communication passed between them. "Very well," he said. "We ride at dawn. The sanctuary at 3 in the morning was a reduced thing, guard rotations, thinned by the outpost losses. Mercer had spent 12 days engineering the perimeter fence lit in patches, where 2 of the 4 generator-fed light banks had developed faults that weren't faults. He stood outside the fence in the darkness and felt the familiar compression of pre-violent stillness, the moment before a system changed states irreversibly. He went through the fence like it wasn't there. The outer wall walkers didn't react to him. He had spent enough time absorbing walker biology that his surface biomass could approximate the particular chemical signature that prevented them from targeting each other. He moved through them like a current through still water, past the chains, past the perimeter, into the yard. The first savior guard saw him and had time to register that something was wrong before. Mercer was on him, fast, precise, the kind of violence that was over before the nervous system finished processing it had begun. He didn't consume him. He restrained him, zipped ties from the man's own belt, and moved to the next position. He cleared the outer yard in 11 minutes. 12 guards, 12 taken down without a weapon discharged. He found the army and did what he told Rick he would do, disabled the weapon stores in a way that would take hours to reverse. Not destroy them, because the communities would need those weapons after. Then he found the main hall and waited. Negan came down the stairs at 4 in the morning, because the radio check-ins had stopped, and silence was a language he spoke fluently. He came with 6 men, Lucille in hand. The performance dialed down to something functional and cold because he already knew, on some level, what the silence meant. He saw Mercer standing in the middle of the empty hall and stopped. For a moment neither of them spoke. The generator hummed. Somewhere in the building, people were sleeping. Outside, the pre-dawn dark was beginning to soften at its edges. "You picked a side," Negan said. "I picked an outcome," Mercer said. The side was incidental. Negan looked at the 6 men around him, at the empty hall, at the exits, which Mercer had positioned himself between. The calculation moved across. His face without theatrical mediation. Just a man doing real math in real time. "My people. Your outer guards are restrained and alive. Your armory is disabled. In approximately 40 minutes, 3 communities are going to come through your gate." Mercer's voice was level. "What happens between now and then is your decision." Lucille came up. Not toward Mercer. Negan held her horizontally. A gesture that was almost meditative. The way a man held something he was deciding whether to use. His eyes were doing the calculation. Mercer had watched them do since the first day in this hall. Running and rerunning the variables. "You could have worked for me," Negan said. Not bitterly. Almost with genuine curiosity. "I could have," Mercer agreed. "It wasn't interesting enough." Something passed across Negan's face. Not defeat exactly. More like the particular expression of a man who had built an empire on understanding, leverage, and was now experiencing the specific humiliation of having misidentified it. He lowered Lucille. The 6 men around him followed his lead. Weapons down. Outside, the first light of dawn was arriving. And with it the sound of engines. Rick's caravan, Ezekiel's riders. The hilltop fighters moving through the sanctuary's open gate. The workers inside were already stirring. Drawn by the silence where there should have been routine. Emerging from their quarters. With the careful disbelief of people who had trained themselves not to hope and were now being asked to recalibrate. Mercer stepped back and let the morning in. He stood against the wall of the main hall while Rick moved through the sanctuary with the controlled urgency of a man who had planned this moment for months, organizing the workers, receiving surrendered weapons, doing the 100 human things that the aftermath of a system's collapse required. Michonne found him there an hour later, sword across her back, watching the organized chaos of liberation with the detached attention he'd been watching. Everything with since he woke up in a ditch off Interstate 95. "It worked," she said. "Yes. Rick wants to talk about next steps. The remaining outposts, the community's coordination going forward. Security for the transition." "That's his work," Mercer said. "Not mine." Michonne looked at him with the careful assessment she'd been applying to him since. "Alexandria. You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Mercer looked at the hall, at the workers moving. Through it with the tentative newly freed energy of people relearning what it felt like to exist without a ceiling. Pressing down. At Rick, already in conversation with 3 community leaders. Already building the thing that came after. Good people doing the necessary human work of reconstruction. Which required exactly the qualities he didn't have and didn't pretend to. "Tell Rick he built something worth protecting," Mercer said. "Tell him to keep building it." He walked out of the sanctuary into the morning. The world Alex Mercer walked into was dead. The world he walked out of was, improbably, trying to live. He moved east through the Virginia woods as the sun came fully up. The blacklight virus running its endless diagnostics. His senses cataloging a landscape that was slowly, stubbornly reasserting itself over the ruins of the old order. Birds in the trees. A deer moving through the mist at the tree line. The sound of walkers in the distance, diminished but permanent. The background frequency of a world that had changed its terms permanently. He thought about Negan in custody, processing the architectural collapse of everything he'd built, doing the particular interior work of a man who had confused control for security. He thought about Rick, already 3 steps into the next problem, carrying the weight of other people's futures with the stubborn grace of someone who hadn't chosen the burden but had decided that putting it down was worse. He thought about the sanctuary's workers, waking up this morning to a mathematics that had changed overnight. He had not saved them. Salvation required investment in outcomes, a willingness to stay and build and lose. He had removed an obstacle. The distinction mattered to him in ways that would have been difficult to explain to anyone in that hall. What he was in this world remained what he had always been: a virus given consciousness, a weapon pointed at a problem, something that existed in the spaces between human categories of good and evil without particularly caring which side of the line it fell on. But the world was trying to live. He found that, against most available evidence about his own nature, he didn't want to be the thing that stopped it. He kept walking,